Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Cool. So, as mentioned, I'm Kia. I work at Gnosis, which is a company that builds kind of new market mechanisms on the Ethereum blockchain. I do strategy, so a little bit of everything. Is this not close? So a little bit of everything. And I also support Full Node, which is a large space for blockchain and Web3 initiatives in Berlin, as well as Guild, Radical Exchange, and Monastery, Trust Support, various other projects. But I won't be talking about any of those today. Instead, I'll be talking about some ideas and kind of rough drafts leaning towards an idea about how protocols and ecologies relate to each other, and how the work that I do on a daily basis in thinking through DAOs and other kind of trust machines and incentive machines can help with the narratives towards ecological conservation and renewable energy. So to start off a talk about ecology, I think it's really appropriate to quote Gregory Bateson. And Bateson is probably best known for the statement that a man, a tree, and an axe is an information system. So he was an early kind of cybernetic thinker and very concerned with questions of ecology and environment. So he writes in an essay called Ecology and Flexibility in Urban Civilization, "We are not outside the ecology for which we plan. We are always inevitably a part of it. Herein lies the charm and the terror of ecology, that the ideas of this science are irreversibly becoming a part of our own eco-social system." So for Bateson, the terror is the fact that we can never fully critique a system in which we are embedded. But what does that have to do with today and talking about blockchain? So rather than give an overly technical description, I think I'll be going through a lot of terms in this talk. So just bear in mind that they're playful terms, and if you don't understand them 100% kind of technically from the ground up, that's no problem. They're really fun to play with. So in terms of giving blockchain a kind of active definition, not to say what it is, but rather like kind of what it enables, you can say it's a protocol which enables a shared public record of interactions and transactions between people without guaranteeing institutions. So this was something that Matt focused on a lot in his earlier talk. So it's the idea that we have trust between each other and we don't need necessarily a centralized institution to do it for us. And I would just caveat that when I say interactions and transactions between people, I would say people, companies, AI, agents, entities, kind of any sort of thing that can interact with a digital or software-based system can interact with a blockchain. So, and in the space, because of these properties of what blockchain supposedly enables, many people are thinking in equal parts about decentralization and organization, and what kind of techno-social structures that entails. So in other words, what kind of political organization is enabled by a new type of cryptographic software. And the term that's most common in the space in thinking through what this politics would be on a technical level, Matt mentioned as well, are DAOs. So DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And most people, when they hear this term, they think that there's some sort of kind of Skynet runaway code, it will enact and automate things automatically. But I would suggest instead, maybe a better working term for the present moment, while you can have automatically executed contracts, and we are probably tending towards that future where AI uses DAOs more than humans do. For the time being, I think it's very reasonable to call them decentralized adaptable organizations. So one definition would be a DAO as a software-based organizational tool for lowering cost and using incentive design to coordinate for common goals. So as spoken before, there's economic incentive. There can also be things like social, ecological, or other types of capital that can be used as incentives. And usually this incentive design aims to kind of like stop certain game theoretical problems or problems of cooperation, collaboration. If everyone's acting in their own self-interest, then obviously there will be conflict. So if you encode incentives, how can you prevent organizational stalemates and failures from things like tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma or the Byzantine general's problem? So these are kind of common game theoretical terms in which there's a crisis of collaboration, where people acting in their own self-interest would in some way harm others, or in another sense, they wouldn't be able to come to a certain decision or able to move ahead because of misaligned incentives. So going through very quickly and kind of playfully like 8 potential qualities of DAOs and what DAOs promise. This isn't something necessarily I one-to-one believe, but what DAOs promise in this space. I will go through 8 qualities related to this very quickly. So one of these is being game theoretically sound in the sense that if there's tragedy of the commons, you want to incentivize that people take care of the stewarded shared resource. Another quality of DAOs would be an idea of hyperscalability. So often in kind of startups, people say like, oh, you have a new app, is it scalable? And that's just a special way of saying how many people does it reach? So DAOs ideally, whereas like an organization or firm can maybe kind of suit up to a couple hundred, a couple thousand people, DAOs aim to be able to have incentives to coordinate people at scale. And probably the closest thing is something like a WoW guild at the moment. DAOs also promise to be permissionless. So the idea that you don't have to sign a membership form or become formally part of an organization to participate. You can just participate when you'd like to and leave when you'd like to. So making kind of voice and exit as easy as possible. DAOs as organizations also promise a certain type of alegality. So that means it's not necessarily legal or illegal, but it's kind of, you're building the bridge as you walk over it, and you're constructing like new forms of legislation and new forms of ways of organizing, which push on the boundaries of current legal limits and legal recognition. DAOs can also be considered self-renewing. So here's the kind of archetypal image of the Hydra, where you cut off one head, it grows another. There's no single point of failure. DAOs can also create institutional knowledge. So in the way that there's a shared, publicly visible record of a blockchain, you kind of create the archive in the instant that an interaction or action happens. And there's institutional knowledge between generations of protocols and generations of people. DAOs can also be pattern creating social norms or designs and architecture of software that then are incorporated into other DAOs or other kind of groups of people at any scale. DAOs also promise being executable. If you know the .exe file type, the sense that you can just start a company or an organization or a protest movement as a kind of file that you download and click on and it runs. So to recap, the kind of 8 qualities, or what I would call the 8 promises of decentralized organizations, are that they're kind of game theoretically sound, they're hyperscalable, permissionless, illegal, self-renewing, they promote institutional knowledge over generations, and they're pattern creating and executable. So a very rough kind of lexicon that people in this space are using and that you can play with as a language to understand what the future people see are. But what are DAOs actually? So this is a screenshot from a live DAO at the moment. Actually, it was hacked recently, but this was it right before. So this is the Genesis Alpha from DAOstack. And so what it is, it's an interface basically just over a kind of blockchain where you can make proposals and people can vote on those proposals. And based on incentives, there are certain proposals that rise to the top that everyone needs to vote on or needs to look at. And it's a way of directing attention. So ideally, you could have a DAO with this interface that makes 1,000 decisions every month is the proposition. So while there are kind of all of this like fancy lexicon and ideas of the future around it, you can think of it as just a web interface with pretty good security behind it, except for this one. So what can DAOs do for natural systems? This is what I'm wondering about at the present moment. So in terms of what they can do for organizing, but also what they can do narratively. So returning to Bateson's essay, I would just read a quote from it again. It is, and this is like where he gets to the end of the essay and he has this like intense moral dilemma, and it's really quite earnest. So, is it important that the right things be done for the right reasons? Is it necessary that those who revise and carry out plans should understand the ecological insights which guided the planners? Or should the original planners put into the very fabric of their plan collateral incentives, which would seduce those who come later into carrying out the plan for reasons quite different from those which inspired the plan? So he's writing this in the context of wanting to set out an ecological plan for urban planning that will be carried out over the next 2 decades. And he doesn't know whether the more effective thing to do is to be able to earnestly communicate the insights that led to the plan, or to bake in dishonest incentives that would carry out the plan without any of its original intention. And one thing kind of left out of the discourse around DAOs and also just the discourse around urban planning and ecology is that often when you combine environment or ecology and planning, it doesn't actually work out to specified code. Often things go wrong. Often ecologies are too complex for us to know. They're a natural system. They're a complex system. We can't actually know if that we touch one thing over there, it won't change something at a distance over here. So in thinking through how we can be more subtle and more oblique in the ways that we try to deal with ecologies, I'll do a few kind of broad fun examples and a few examples of blockchain artwork in this space. So in 2017, researchers published a paper looking at the effects certain trees have on wireless signal propagation. And Jeff Main on his blog recently just wrote a post about computational landscape architecture. And he writes, what interests me here is the possibility that we might someday begin landscaping our suburbs, our corporate campuses, our urban business parks, according to which species of vegetation are less likely to block Wi-Fi. And what he generally sketches out and kind of asks is, what if there's Wi-Fi scaping, landscapes sown specifically for their electromagnetic propagation effects? And there are kind of historical examples of similar thinking. So this is an aerial photo of the Institute of Radiation Breeding in Japan from the 60s. I believe they still have some activity going on, as well as an exhibition called the Atomic Garden exhibit in 1961 in the US. So this came about right around there was the Atoms for Peace program, trying to look at how nuclear energy can be put towards more effective ends rather than as a military technology. And the small farmers, like, what they would do, they would take gamma ray radiation and basically plant concentric circles of crops around it and see what mutations happened. And it was kind of like early thinking around what GMOs could be or would be, but obviously much more experimental. People grew anything from tomatoes to, I love this, to tulips as well. So there are kind of oblique ways of thinking through how the technologies and the spectrum, the kind of natural things that we have indirectly impact the ecologies that we are trying to cultivate or garden. And kind of fast forwarding to today, there's a few early examples in this space that I think through both DAOs for natural systems and how we kind of sculpt and cultivate the world around us. So the classic example right now is the plantoid by Primavera de Filippi. She writes a lot on law and governance in the blockchain space, but also has this project where it's a kind of metal plantoid that incentivizes through cryptocurrency people to make more of them and to make their own and for them to just propagate widely. There's also a recent work that showed in Berlin in 2018 at the Proof of Work exhibition at the Schinkel Pavilion, Prema Demon. So this is a work by Terra Zero. They're a kind of collective and wider group of people who originally did a project called Terra Zero, which is now their group name. And they proposed the idea of a forest that owns itself through kind of blockchain organizations and platforms. So here's a shot of the exhibition. Basically what it is, it's a little bonsai tree that was put in the gallery. And there's various things that it needs to have taken care of over the course of the exhibition. So and it's a very special bonsai tree because it actually has an Ethereum wallet address. It's like a new bonsai tree. And basically, there's a few different things that it needs taken care of over the course of the exhibition. So it needs watering, lighting, leaf trimming, and there's sensors hooked up to sense when it's dehydrated or whatever. And then if you see on the screen, kind of on the front of it right there, there's a little interface that says when it needs different funds in order to incentivize people in the gallery or otherwise to water it or to automatically water it. And anyone can go online to a website and basically send funds to this Ethereum address and specify in which category they want to care for the plant. I think it also even had an open bazaar store so that it could purchase things if it wanted to, like kind of a blockchain eBay, but no one ever donated to that category. And basically, what it tries to propose is a form of economic autonomy and sovereignty in a sense that people kind of pay for the care. You could think of it kind of like wages for Facebook or other things. I'm not like 100% on this line of thinking, but I do think it opens up a space in what kind of incorporating ecologies into capital means for how we think about them. So some of the creators of this piece, they wrote an essay about it, and they cited this work by Carl Schroeder called DAOs, DACs for natural systems, or DAOs for natural systems. And he writes, and this is the context in which this work that I just described is sitting. So the rather simple question underlying the idea is, why stop at corporations as persons? Several nations have already enshrined or are in the process of enshrining rights for natural systems. Rivers, watersheds, coral reefs, mountain biomes, all could be represented by DAOs, and the goods and services they provided defined in their charter. Might this be a better way to protect and promote the interests of natural systems and other species, rather than tying political actions to antagonistic ideological human-based movements? This is not save the whales, it is give the whales the tools to save themselves, end quote. Do you think DAOs could be used by our non-human ecosystem service providers? So I do think there's a lot of ego and hubris involved in saying that we need to give whales tools to save themselves from the rapid anthropogenic pollution. But I do think it's important to note that this is a way, and something that I've been thinking about calling a technology of recognition. So what are the narrative tools or the technical tools that we have to recognize something as autonomous? So we have certain things like legal technologies of recognition. So this is, in New Zealand, there's a river with personhood. And then you could say we have the digital, which is a force that owns and incentivizes care of itself and manages its own resources. And we also have social, where we think of ecology as a companion rather than something that's stewarded or directly controlled. And why is this important? Why do we have to have these technologies of recognition? So one book and one line of thought in terms of climate crisis I've been very interested in recently is Half Earth by E.O. Wilson. So he's been doing this work all of his life. I think he actually is one of the people who coined the term biodiversity. And the book Half Earth well, I'll just read this quote first. But so he's a conservationist. Global conservation thus far, when averaged out for land-dwelling vertebrates, has lowered extinction rates of species by approximately 20%. So the half-Earth hypothesis says, what if we made almost half of Earth like a natural park, and part of that like a human exclusion zone? And obviously, the transition from where we are currently to that would not be very kind. So what are the narratives that we can do to just help conservation in general? And is there something about a false flag of autonomy of ecosystems that can give a window to a certain kind of conservationism and the kind of half park that owns itself? Maybe we would respect it more. So just generally, I wonder, while we produce ever finer sensing tools and kind of digital tools, we don't necessarily think about how the environment senses us. And it's a tendency and philosophy of kind of computer science and just general engineering to give labels to more and more things and to more and more discrete things, which ends up being just a system of transferring ownership or transferring value. So can we short-circuit this tendency to create ever more fine-tuned labels and discrete points of entry for markets and kind of micro-markets and exploitative capitalism? Because we're not separate from the protocols and the ecologies we interact with. However many tools we have created for an objective record, we still are left with a kind of consensus reality. So a lot of people in the space talk about governance as the main tool for, fighting climate change, for controlling kind of software protocols or whatever. But there's always decisions that are made by ecology that are outside of our control. And what are the other tools we can bring to it other than, kind of having endless climate kind of summits or otherwise? So there's this diagram in terms of tools you can use to think through how you enact change in the world. So you see the really slow, and this is a kind of pace layering diagram in the sense that there's a really slow arc of nature, but there's a kind of flippancy of fashion, and culture moves just a little bit faster than nature, but you also have governance and infrastructure. And what are the different layers and ways that we can think through these things? So even just looking at how Ethereum, which is the kind of one particular kind of cult of belief that with liberal values and kind of the blockchain community that I've been more drawn to, just this in terms of the community creates so many different versions of the Ethereum logo, and some of them represent different chains themselves, different kind of communities. But what are these aesthetic values and how they propagate and how do they change and mark different parts of the community and tell the story of Ethereum differently? And how does the kind of what's becoming the blockchain cultural industrial complex, the fact that we're gathered here in a kind of cultural setting to talk about narratives of blockchain, how can you use that to influence kind of the Overton window or various other fields? So I guess the main question of my talk, and rather rather new draft ideas that like how when talking about software protocols can we change the narratives of how ecologies are conserved, perceived, and respected, and what narratives in play can we co-opt? And if there are like, if we make more and more kind of ecological things legible to capital, will that be a good enough excuse for us to leave them alone? Is one not major solution, but minor tactic? Because we can't forfeit spaces of the imaginal to those we disagree with. That's actually it.